In the western corner of Pennsylvania, the land folds itself into ridges and hollows so old that they seem older than the names written on any map. Fog collects there in the mornings, heavy and white, rolling through the pines like a slow, moving tide. To most travelers, it is simply another stretch of countryside, miles of fence line, barn roofs, and creek crossings. But those who have lived in the region long enough will tell you that the valleys remember. They keep echoes, and sometimes they return them. The story that draws historians again and again to these hills begins with a man named Elias Whitmore, who settled the valley in 1792. His journals record little beyond the practical: the depth of the well, the number of sheep lost to wolves, the cost of nails brought in from Pittsburgh. Yet between those ordinary lines runs another thread, a fascination with the land itself, almost a belief that the soil could listen. He built a meeting house beside a cold spring that never froze even in January, claiming that its waters spoke of covenant. To later generations it was merely an old church. To Elias it was a promise. 2 centuries later, that church was nothing but stone walls overrun with ivy, when a graduate researcher named Clara Hensley arrived from the University of Pittsburgh. Her assignment was to catalog defunct frontier congregations. She expected pew dust and splintered hymnals, not a mystery. The locals in the nearest town, Waynesburg, were courteous but distant when she asked for directions. One man at the diner simply said, "The road's there if you need it, but the valley keeps what it's given." Clara smiled politely, chalking it up to rural superstition. The road to Whitmore Hollow wound through fields where the soil shone black after rain. She drove until the asphalt narrowed to gravel, then to twin ruts cut into grass. The air smelled of iron and pine. By late afternoon, she reached a ridge from which she could see the hollow below, an oval of shadow cupped between slopes, a stream glinting like a thread of glass. The remains of the meeting house stood at the center, roof collapsed inward, the pulpit stone still upright like a monument that refused to fall. Inside, sunlight angled through gaps in the roof, catching motes of dust. Clara's boots sank slightly in the damp earth that had swallowed the wooden floorboards. She photographed the altar, the arch of the windows, the faint lettering on a plaque that read 1794, "Let the faithful endure." When she knelt to photograph the stone, she noticed something wedged between 2 blocks, a scrap of paper sealed with a crumb of red wax. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded to brown. Only the first sentence remained clear: "We have done as the water required." The phrase lodged in her mind as she packed her gear. It was too deliberate to be nonsense, yet too strange to fit any known doctrine. She slipped the fragment into a field envelope and noted the coordinates. As she turned to leave, a low breeze moved through the hollow. For an instant the surface of the stream outside rippled in a circle, though nothing had fallen into it. That evening she checked into the small motel in Waynesburg. The clerk recognized the name of the valley and gave a thin smile. "You came back in one piece," she said. When Clara laughed, the woman added quietly, "Most folks don't go twice." Clara uploaded her photographs, cataloged her notes, and poured coffee while the files transferred. One image froze halfway through rendering, the shot of the altar stone. Across the blurred surface of the photo, a faint second set of words appeared, as if scrawled in light: "Keep the covenant." She assumed it was a glitch, closed the laptop, and went to bed. The air conditioner hummed softly, masking the sound of distant traffic. Somewhere between waking and sleep, she thought she heard water running, though the motel's plumbing had gone silent hours earlier. She woke before dawn, the world outside still blue with mist. The highway lights beyond the motel blinked through the fog like faint beacons. Her dreams had left behind a thin residue of unease. She could still hear the phantom rush of water, the rhythm of a spring that had no source. She made coffee, loaded her gear into the car, and told herself she would visit the county archives before heading home. One more look at the records might clarify who Elias Whitmore had been and why he had written about a covenant. The Greene County Courthouse occupied a brick building that had once been a school. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The clerk, a man in his 60s with steel-rimmed glasses, guided her to the basement archives. There, in the brittle records of land transfers, she found the original deed for Whitmore Hollow, 1792, 200 acres, bordered by creek and ridge, to be held by the family and their descendants in perpetuity. Beneath the signature, written in a thinner ink, was an added clause, to be surrendered only upon the end of the covenant. No further explanation, no witness marks, only that one ominous phrase repeated from the fragment in her envelope. Clara copied the page, thanked the clerk, and stepped back into the street. A drizzle had started, dotting the courthouse steps with dark circles. She thought of the spring again, of water that never froze, of land that could not be surrendered. Against reason, curiosity pulled her back toward the valley. The drive down felt shorter the second time. The rain had turned the dirt track to a slick ribbon of mud, but she eased the car forward until the road opened into the clearing. Everything looked the same, yet not quite. The meeting house seemed to stand straighter, its stones darker as if newly washed. She left the engine idling, stepped out, and listened. The valley was utterly quiet except for the faint hiss of the stream. She walked to the spring. The surface trembled under the falling drizzle, and for an instant she saw the reflection of the church, not as ruin but whole. Roof intact, windows gleaming. The image vanished with the next ripple. She took a photo, then another. When she checked the preview, both images showed only fog. Inside the church, she unpacked her recorder. Survey log, day 2. She said softly, her voice echoing off the stone. She described the weather, the condition of the structure, the location of the spring. Then she paused. On the altar lay the paper fragment she had taken yesterday, though she was certain it had been sealed in her field kit. The wax looked fresh, the edges uncreased. Someone, or something, had replaced it. Her pulse quickened. She lifted it gently, expecting the same line she had read before. Instead, the ink now formed different words. Keep the covenant, Clara Hensley. The letters shimmered faintly as if the ink were still drying. She dropped the paper, heart pounding. For several long seconds she stood motionless, listening for footsteps, for any sign she wasn't alone. But the valley remained silent. Only the wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of wet earth. By afternoon, she forced herself back to the car. She drove until the cell signal returned, then pulled to the roadside and opened her laptop. The new photographs displayed perfectly clear. The altar, the fragment, the name written upon it. No logical explanation offered itself. She shut the lid, took a deep breath, and began dictating notes. Every field researcher has moments when history resists explanation. She decided this would be one of them. Yet beneath that rationalization, she felt a strange pull, as if the valley had memorized her name and would not let it go. Back in Waynesburg, she stopped at the diner for coffee. The man in the wool cap from her previous visit was there again, reading a folded newspaper. When he saw her mud-streaked boots, he gave a small, knowing nod. "You went back," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. He tapped the edge of his cup. "Sometimes the hollow shows you what it wants you to see. Sometimes it just shows you yourself." That night in the motel, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection of the intact church on the spring's surface, the words that had appeared in fresh ink. She told herself she would leave at dawn, file the report, and move on to the next site. But just before sunrise, she woke to the faint sound of bells, 3 slow tolls that faded into the distance. When she looked out the window, the sky was clear, the road empty, no church for miles. She packed quickly, started the car, and headed east. At the first rise beyond the valley, she glanced back. Mist was already gathering again, rolling through the trees. For a brief second, the sunlight caught on something metallic near the stream, a glint like the edge of a key. A week passed before Clara allowed herself to open the field folder again. She had filed her preliminary report, answered a few polite questions from her advisor, and buried the Whitmore material under other projects. Yet the photographs lived in the back of her mind like half-remembered songs. Each time she walked past the filing cabinet, she could almost hear running water. Curiosity or guilt finally won. One Sunday morning, she spread everything across her kitchen table and began to reread. The fragments were stranger now than she had remembered. The handwriting was still precise, the language archaic yet deliberate. Repetition wove through the pages, phrases about binding, about the spring that never froze, about silence kept beneath the house of meeting. It felt less like theology and more like a coded set of instructions. She tried cross-referencing names in county records, but found nothing beyond the earliest census entry. Elias Whitmore, head of household, 6 persons, occupation, minister. After 1800, the name vanished. By late afternoon, she was scribbling notes faster than she could organize them. Her rational side told her that the disappearance was normal. Families moved, records were lost. But something about the precision of the writing refused to be dismissed as superstition. It read like a man recording a transaction rather than a sermon. "We have done as required," one line said. Required by whom? Required for what? When the light began to fade, she stacked the pages neatly, made tea, and opened her laptop to draft an article proposal. The screen blinked once, twice, then filled with a gray haze before the desktop reappeared. In the corner of the screen, a new document icon had materialized, untitled. She hesitated, then opened it. 3 words appeared in the middle of an otherwise blank page: "Return to hollow." She stared at the phrase for a long minute. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound, and blamed the automatic synchronization of her Notes app. Yet she couldn't find the file anywhere in her directories once she closed it. 2 days later, an email arrived from a number she didn't recognize, County Historical Society at Greenupa. Gov. The message was brief: records request approved, additional materials found, viewing by appointment only. She hadn't submitted any request. Clara booked an appointment with the Greene County Historical Society for the following Thursday. The building sat at the edge of town, a converted mansion whose windows looked permanently half asleep beneath their shutters. Inside, the curator, a thin woman named Mrs. Doran, led her to a long oak table. "You asked for Whitmore records," the woman said. "They aren't many." The folders contained letters, property ledgers, and one faded sketch of the old church. Nothing should have been surprising, yet Clara's pulse quickened when she saw a familiar hand on the oldest document, Elias Whitmore. This one wasn't a sermon or a deed, but a diary page. April 12, 1798. The water keeps its color today. We have sung, and the sound came back as always, though fainter. I will write again when the silence deepens. She copied the page carefully. Mrs. Doran noticed her concentration. "People still ask about him," she said. "Mostly students. They all say they hear something when they visit that place." Clara smiled politely, but made a note to compare the phrasing with the fragments she had already photographed. Back at the motel, she laid both texts side by side. The ink, though written a century apart, looked identical in tone. Either the copies had been made with the same pigment, or someone much later had added to the journal. The discovery should have thrilled her. Instead, it felt like confirmation of an unseen hand quietly editing history. She decided she needed to return one last time, not to chase mystery, but to verify the site before closing her report. If she documented every detail, maybe the unease would fade. The next morning dawned cold and clear. She followed the same road, passing the same fields, yet everything seemed subtly rearranged, as if the valley had shifted overnight. When she reached the hollow, the air felt charged, metallic, like the moment before lightning. She set up her camera and began to record her notes aloud. Site log April 18, weather fair, water level consistent, structural integrity unchanged. Her voice steadied as she worked. She photographed the spring, the pews, the lettering on the plaque. Only when she turned toward the altar did she notice a new object resting there, a small brass key, dulled by tarnish. It was identical to the one she had glimpsed in the old box under the hatch a week earlier. She took a deep breath, slipped it into her pocket, and whispered for documentation. The moment she did, the wind fell away, the leaves stopped moving, even the water of the stream seemed to pause. The silence was so complete that her own heartbeat sounded intrusive. Then, slowly, the sound returned, the soft trickle of the spring, the rustle of branches, but the rhythm felt slightly out of step, as though the valley were catching its breath. She closed her notebook. That's enough for today. When she looked up, the light had changed. The sun hung lower than it should have. Time had slipped somehow. She hurried to the car, started the engine, and looked back once. The meeting house stood in perfect stillness, its broken roof glowing amber in the dusk. For a second, she could swear she saw a figure in the doorway, watching all, coat long to the knees, hat brim low. Then the shadow dissolved into ordinary darkness. She drove back toward Waynesburg with the window cracked open. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. Her hands shook a little on the steering wheel, more from exhaustion than fear. At the first gas station, she stopped for coffee and tried to convince herself that the figure she'd seen had been a trick of light, nothing more than a shadow cast by the trees. At the motel, she uploaded the day's images. For the first time, every photograph appeared perfectly normal. Relief flooded her, proof that the earlier anomalies had been camera faults after all. She began labeling each file, working methodically, until she reached the final picture, the one she had taken just before leaving. The frame was ordinary, the ruined church in late afternoon, but across the lower corner ran a faint reflection, a shape in the glass of the window that looked uncomfortably like her own face, older, the eyes watching rather than photographing. She sat back, closed the laptop, and forced a laugh. "Enough," she said aloud. "I'm seeing patterns where there are none." To clear her head, she walked to the diner for dinner. The same man in the wool cap was there again, the paper folded beside his cup. When she told him she planned to finish her report that night, he nodded. "Best to finish things," he said. "That valley doesn't like loose ends." Back in her room, the brass key on the desk caught the lamplight. She hadn't meant to keep it, yet she couldn't make herself return it either. On impulse, she wrapped it in tissue and placed it in her notebook. The moment she did, a faint metallic sound echoed from the hallway, like another key turning in a distant lock. She opened the door quickly. The corridor was empty. Sleep came fitfully. Each time she drifted off, she heard water and the scrape of something metal against stone. Just before dawn, she dreamed she was standing inside the meeting house again. The roof was whole. Candlelight flickered across wooden pews. At the altar stood Elias Whitmore, his head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. When he lifted his face, he looked straight at her and said very clearly, "Keep the record." She woke with the taste of iron in her mouth. By midday, she was on the road back to Pittsburgh. The clouds lifted as the miles passed, and by the time she reached the city, she almost believed she'd imagined it all. The next week, she delivered her final presentation to the department. Thorough, professional, grounded entirely in verifiable sources. No mention of whispers or keys, only the usual conclusion. Site abandoned circa 1810, likely due to economic migration. Her colleagues praised the detail of her photographs. One of them pointed to a frame on the projector screen. "Interesting how you captured yourself in the reflection," he said. She frowned. "I wasn't in that shot." He smiled. "Still looks a bit like you." She didn't answer. That night she filed her notes, locked the drawer, and promised herself she was finished with Whitmore Hollow. But as she turned off her office light, a drop of water fell onto the papers, a single, clear bead, as if from a leak in the ceiling. She looked up. The plaster was dry. The weeks after her presentation should have returned Clara to ordinary life. She had papers to grade, grant forms to fill out, lectures to prepare. Yet the Whitmore material refused to fade. Every time she opened a textbook about frontier religion, her mind drifted back to the hollow, the stream that never froze, the clause in the deed, the strange identical ink. One rainy afternoon she visited the university library to check something simple. When had the last surviving member of the Whitmore family died? The census data stopped in 1800, but church burial records sometimes filled the gaps. She searched the digitized index and found a single entry. Nathaniel Whitmore, d. 1834, buried unmarked. No Elias, no descendants. It was as if the rest had been erased. Intrigued, she ordered the microfilm of the original parish register. When the gray images appeared on the reader, a marginal note caught her eye. Tiny handwriting beside the 1834 entry, reinterred at the hollow per covenant. She read it twice, reinterred, not interred. Someone had been moved back to the valley. Her curiosity turned to determination. She emailed Mrs. Doran at the Historical Society, asking whether any local maps showed old burial plots. The reply came within the hour. Only one marked site remains near the spring. Be advised the ground is unstable after recent rains. That warning would have stopped a sensible person. Clara booked a day off and drove west. The hills looked washed clean by the storm, the creeks swollen. She parked at the same turnoff, the gravel crunching under her tires, and followed the track on foot. Mud clung to her boots, making each step heavy. By the time she reached the clearing, mist was curling low around the stones. The meeting house appeared smaller than she remembered, as though the valley had grown taller. The stream, usually a quiet thread, rushed noisily over its stones. She stood listening, the rhythm almost like words, broken syllables carried by water. When she turned toward the spring, she saw a shallow depression near its edge, ringed with slate. The soil looked recently disturbed. She knelt, brushed away loose leaves, and uncovered the outline of an old marker. A flat piece of sandstone engraved only with a single letter W. Her pulse quickened. This had to be the reinterred grave. She took photographs, measured the dimensions, and began sketching. The light dimmed as clouds thickened overhead. She decided to collect a small sample of the soil for testing, routine procedure, she told herself. As she pressed the vial into the earth, the rain started again, a soft drizzle that made the mud shine. The smell of iron returned. For a moment she thought she heard a hum, low and continuous, as if the valley itself exhaled. She capped the vial and backed away. Enough data for one day. The weeks after her presentation should have returned Clara to ordinary life. She had papers to grade, grant forms to fill out, lectures to prepare. Yet the Whitmore material refused to fade. Every time she opened a textbook about frontier religion, her mind drifted back to the hollow, the stream that never froze, the clause in the deed, the strange identical ink. One rainy afternoon she visited the university library to check something simple. When had the last surviving member of the Whitmore family died? The census data stopped in 1800, but church burial records sometimes filled the gaps. She searched the digitized index and found a single entry. Nathaniel Whitmore, d. 1834, buried unmarked. No Elias, no descendants. It was as if the rest had been erased. Intrigued, she ordered the microfilm of the original parish register. When the gray images appeared on the reader, a marginal note caught her eye. Tiny handwriting beside the 1834 entry, reinterred at the hollow per covenant. She read it twice, reinterred, not interred. Someone had been moved back to the valley. Her curiosity turned to determination. She emailed Mrs. Doran at the Historical Society, asking whether any local maps showed old burial plots. The reply came within the hour. Only one marked site remains near the spring. Be advised, the ground is unstable after recent rains. That warning would have stopped a sensible person. Clara booked a day off and drove west. The hills looked washed clean by the storm, the creeks swollen. She parked at the same turnoff, the gravel crunching under her tires, and followed the track on foot. Mud clung to her boots, making each step heavy. By the time she reached the clearing, mist was curling low around the stones. The meeting house appeared smaller than she remembered, as though the valley had grown taller. The stream, usually a quiet thread, rushed noisily over its stones. She stood listening, the rhythm almost like words, broken syllables carried by water. When she turned toward the spring, she saw a shallow depression near its edge, ringed with slate. The soil looked recently disturbed. She knelt, brushed away loose leaves, and uncovered the outline of an old marker, a flat piece of sandstone engraved only with a single letter W. Her pulse quickened. This had to be the reinterred grave. She took photographs, measured the dimensions, and began sketching. The light dimmed as clouds thickened overhead. She decided to collect a small sample of the soil for testing. Routine procedure, she told herself. As she pressed the vial into the earth, the rain started again, a soft drizzle that made the mud shine. The smell of iron returned. For a moment she thought she heard a hum, low and continuous, as if the valley itself exhaled. She kept the vial and backed away. Enough data for one day. Back at the motel, Clara laid the soil sample on the desk to dry beside her notes. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the window like fingers on glass. She wrote a few lines in her field journal. Possible secondary burial site near spring. Inscription limited to single initial. Evidence of post-1830 disturbance. The formality of the words steadied her. Turning observation into data had always been her way of staying grounded. When she looked again at the vial, condensation had formed inside the glass. A fine mist swirled at the bottom, as though the soil were breathing. She unscrewed the cap slightly, and the air that escaped smelled faintly of cold water. She sealed it again, labeling it carefully. Sample A. Whitmore Hollow. Sleep came late. At some point during the night, she dreamed she was sitting in the library, surrounded by open books. The pages turned on their own, stopping on a passage written in her own handwriting. The covenant was an exchange, silence for memory. She woke with the words still in her head. The next morning, she visited the courthouse once more. The clerk, now familiar with her curiosity, smiled. "You're becoming a local legend yourself," he said, still chasing the Whitmores. She nodded and asked whether any correspondence existed between the family and neighboring congregations. He led her to a set of bound volumes labeled Presbytery Records, 1790-1810. Inside, she found a single letter from Elias Whitmore addressed to a Reverend Jonathan Hale. The language was formal but strained. "I have fulfilled the charge laid upon me. The water is stilled, the voices cease. Let the presbytery judge me as it will, for I have secured the covenant." Beneath the signature someone, perhaps Hale himself, had written in pencil, "Madness, remove him from pulpit." Clara photographed the page and leaned back in her chair. The evidence was mounting towards something both mundane and unnerving. A minister who believed he had made a divine bargain with the land itself, dismissed for mental instability. Yet she couldn't ignore the practical puzzle. If Elias had been removed, who continued the record after him? The inconsistency suggested a later hand, yet the style never changed. She spent the afternoon piecing together timelines. By 1802, the congregation had dissolved. By 1810, tax records listed the property as abandoned. Still, new entries in Elias's hand continued until at least 1834, the year Nathaniel's body had been reinterred. Somehow the writing persisted decades after the author's death. The simplest explanation was forgery. The more complicated one refused to form in her mind. At sunset, she closed her laptop and stared at the brass key she still kept wrapped in tissue. She had brought it from the university, telling herself she would return it eventually. Now she wondered whether it might fit a lock somewhere within the meeting house. The thought felt reckless, but she couldn't shake it. One more visit, she thought, then I'll be finished. Clara drove back toward the valley 2 days later under a sky the color of slate. The brass key rested in her coat pocket, heavier than it should have been. She parked at the ridge and walked the last half-mile. The air was cold, the hills silent except for the sound of her boots on the gravel path. Inside the meeting house the air was still, almost expectant. She crossed to the altar where she had first found the sealed papers. Beneath the stone base, she noticed a narrow iron latch, half buried in silt. The key fit perfectly. When she turned it, a hollow click echoed through the room, and the floor shifted a fraction of an inch. Dust sifted down in a thin curtain. Beneath the loosened boards, she discovered a wooden chest no larger than a typewriter case. Its hinges creaked when she lifted the lid. Inside lay several bound booklets wrapped in cloth. The top one bore a title written in the same familiar hand, Covenant Record 1792-1834. She opened it carefully. The first pages repeated details she already knew, dates, baptisms, notes on harvests. Then the writing changed. The entries grew disjointed, as if the author's thoughts were slipping between scripture and confession. April 3, the water speaks less now. Perhaps we have paid enough. June 7, they say I am unwell, but the spring remains clear. The Lord remembers. September 19, Nathaniel will carry the words when I cannot. The covenant endures through the line. The final entry, dated 1834, was in a different hand. Still neat, but heavier. Father is quiet at last. I have brought him home to the hollow as promised. The record ends here. Clara sat for a long moment, the wind moving gently through the broken rafters above her. She realized that what she held was not merely a journal, but the continuous testimony of a family convinced that their faith had bound them to the land. Whether it was madness or metaphor no longer mattered. The belief itself had shaped everything that followed. When she stepped outside, dusk had settled over the valley. The stream glimmered pale under the fading light, calm and ordinary. She sealed the booklet in her pack, locked the church door behind her, and walked back up the path without looking over her shoulder. The valley said nothing. Only the faint sound of water followed her, steady and constant, as though marking an unseen line between the past and the present. Clara returned to Pittsburgh with the Covenant book wrapped carefully in brown paper. For the first few days, she tried to treat it like any other primary source. She catalogued the dimensions, counted the pages, noted the fading of the ink. Yet every time she touched the cover, she felt as if the grain of the leather resisted her fingers, the way an old door resists being opened. At the university archive, she requested permission to deposit the text under temporary review. The archivist, Dr. Raman, was impressed by the find. "If this is authentic," he said, "it fills a real gap in early frontier religion." Clara nodded but said nothing about the unease that clung to the manuscript. She left it in the temperature-controlled vault and tried to return to her lectures. For a week, her life resumed its familiar rhythm. Then small disruptions began to appear. One morning, she found a thin trail of moisture across her office desk, as though someone had drawn a line with a wet brush. The next evening, she discovered that the key she kept in her bag, the one from the hollow, was missing. She assumed it had slipped out somewhere, but when she visited the vault 2 days later, she noticed the lock on the cabinet where the Whitmore book was stored bore faint scratches around the keyhole. She asked Dr. Raman if anyone else had handled the item. He checked the log and frowned. "Just you," he said, "no other signatures." That night she stayed late in the library, scrolling through digitized letters from the early 19th century. In a collection from a Reverend Hale, she found a final note written years after his earlier correspondence with Elias Whitmore. It reads simply, "The silence continues. The covenant holds though the minister is long gone. I pray it ends with the next generation." The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had been frightened even while recording the words. Clara sat back, letting the computer screen dim. The hollow, the repeated ink, the identical phrasing across decades. It all pointed to a family whose identity had fused with belief until the two were indistinguishable. Their covenant wasn't just superstition, it was lineage. She left the library just before midnight. The rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier. As she crossed the courtyard, she noticed the sound of water coming from the drain pipes, a steady rhythm that seemed almost to echo her footsteps. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. She stopped, listened. The sound continued, independent of her movement. When she looked up, every window of the archive building reflected the same image, the faint outline of a ridge and a stream beneath mist. She didn't go back inside. Instead, she walked home through the rain, the pattern of the drops forming a kind of unintentional music. And for the first time she understood what the Whitmores might have meant by the water speaking. It wasn't voices or ghosts, it was memory returning through the senses, the persistence of something that refused to be forgotten. At home she made tea and sat by the window, notebook open, the pages filling with half-legible thoughts. "Perhaps belief leaves residue," she wrote. "Perhaps memory seeps through material the way water seeps through stone." She paused, listening to the rain against the glass. Every few seconds the rhythm faltered, as though another sound, lighter, deliberate, joined in beneath it. When she looked, there was nothing but the streetlights shining on wet pavement. The next morning the weather cleared. Sunlight filtered through the window, ordinary and reassuring. Clara spent the day analyzing her transcriptions. The phrase, "keep the covenant," appeared at irregular intervals throughout the journal, always in the same ink, but the script varied subtly, as though written by many hands imitating one another. She realized the family had probably treated the record as a communal artifact, adding to it generation after generation, preserving the exact words to maintain continuity. It was a living ritual disguised as documentation. That evening, she met Dr. Raman for coffee. He asked if she would be willing to publish an article on the manuscript's provenance. "People will be interested," he said. "A whole frontier sect no one's heard of." She agreed to draft a summary, but requested that the location of the valley remain confidential. He nodded, making a note. "Historians can be discreet," he said with a smile. For a while things returned to normal. Students came and went, deadlines passed, and the Whitmore materials rested quietly in their cabinet. Then one afternoon, a maintenance worker reported a leak in the archive basement. When Clara went to inspect it, she found a thin stream of clear water seeping from the concrete wall behind the cabinet where the covenant book was kept. The source couldn't be identified. The plumbing didn't even run through that section. She helped move the cabinet to a dry area, and together they mopped up the water. When she lifted the last of the puddles with a cloth, she noticed faint marks on the floor beneath, the outline of a circle drawn in dust, intersected by a cross. A familiar chill passed through her. She said nothing to the maintenance worker. That night she dreamed again of the valley, but this time it was bright with morning light. Children played near the stream, their laughter echoing off the ridges. An older man stood by the meeting house door, smiling gently. He raised his hand as if in greeting, and she realized with a shock that it was Elias Whitmore, exactly as his portrait showed him in the archive photographs. His lips moved, but she could only make out one phrase, "The record keeps you now." She woke just before dawn, heart steady but mind racing. The following day she sealed the notebook, archived her notes, and wrote her final entry. The covenant was memory. The land remembers those who record it. She placed the brass key, still faintly tarnished, atop the closed file before locking it away. From the hallway she could hear the quiet hum of the dehumidifiers in the archive room, a low, steady sound like distant running water. When she stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The campus lawns glittered with moisture, every blade of grass reflecting a sliver of morning light. She took a deep breath, feeling the air cool and clean, and for the first time in months she didn't hear echoes of the hollow in her thoughts. The covenant, whatever it had been, belonged to the past. Her task was simply to preserve its traces, so that forgetting would not repeat the same silence. She walked toward her lecture hall, the sun rising behind her. The story of the Whitmores was complete now, not as a haunting, but as history, a record of belief so strong it shaped the world around it. Somewhere far away in the Pennsylvania hills, a spring continued to run clear, unfreezing through every winter, carrying forward the quiet memory of all who had once listened to its voice. Spring returned to Pennsylvania almost unnoticed. Snow melted from the ridges, the creeks filled again, and the woods around Whitmore Hollow turned bright with young leaves. Clara had moved on to a new semester, new students, new lectures, but sometimes between classes she caught herself sketching the outline of the valley in the margins of her notes. It had become a kind of symbol, of curiosity, of endurance, of how memory lingered in the landscape. In early April, a letter arrived at the university addressed in an unfamiliar hand. The return label read Nathaniel Whitmore Foundation, a name she had never heard before. Inside was a polite invitation to a private archive opening in Philadelphia. Materials related to early Pennsylvania congregations. The letter said. She hesitated, then decided to go. Research was, after all, her profession. The event was held in an old Quaker meeting hall converted into a museum. Glass cases lined the room, each displaying yellowed documents, hymnals, and silver communion cups. At the far end, a curator greeted her warmly. "Dr. Hensley, we're honored. You've already done so much to bring the Whitmore material to light." He led her to a case containing a single object, a brass key identical to hers. Beneath it lay a note, recovered from the Whitmore estate sale, 1911. Clara's pulse quickened. She asked if the foundation had any connection to the original family. The curator nodded. A few descendants kept the name, though they left the valley long ago. The foundation maintains what records survived. He handed her a folder. Inside were letters from the late 19th century, ordinary correspondence about property and taxes, until one caught her eye. It was addressed to Clara Whitmore, the same first name as hers, the spelling slightly altered. The letter's content was mundane, but the coincidence unsettled her. That night in her hotel room she studied the folder again. The pattern of the family's migrations formed a slow spiral back toward the region where the hollow lay. Generation after generation, the Whitmores had left and returned, as if tied to that single pocket of land by some invisible thread. The thought was oddly comforting. Maybe all historians were bound in similar ways, tracing circles around the past until understanding emerged. She decided to visit the valley one last time before summer. Not as a researcher this time, but simply to see it in the fullness of the season. The road was easier now, the trees lush with new leaves. When she reached the ridge, sunlight poured into the hollow, turning the stream into a silver ribbon. The meeting house still stood, quiet and dignified in its ruin. She sat by the spring, listening. The water ran steadily, unchanging, no whispers, no visions, just the sound of a landscape at peace with its own history. She stayed by the spring for hours, letting the sound of the water settle the jumble of thoughts that had followed her all winter. For the first time since she had opened Elias Whitmore's journals, the valley felt ordinary. No hidden meanings, no codes to decipher. Yet the ordinariness itself carried a strange dignity, as though the land had been waiting for someone simply to see it without fear. As the light began to fade, she packed her notebook and stood. On impulse, she took the small brass key from her pocket. The metal was warm from her hand. She knelt beside the stone marker with the single W and pressed the key into the soil until it disappeared. "For the record," she murmured. The gesture was meaningless and meaningful at once, a way to return what never really belonged to her. The walk back to her car was quiet. No shadows moved in the trees, no wind stirred the grass. When she reached the ridge, she turned for one last look. The hollow lay beneath her like a bowl of dusk light, the stream glinting between the reeds. It looked smaller than she remembered, contained, complete. She felt no need to come again. Back in the city, she poured her energy into finishing the article that Dr. Raman had suggested. She wrote with clarity now, no longer chasing mystery, but describing it as a historian. How frontier families used landscape to preserve identity, how faith could become geography. The Whitmore covenant, she argued, was less a pact with the divine than a method of remembrance, a promise passed through handwriting and ritual to keep a story alive. When the paper was published, colleagues congratulated her. Reviewers called it an elegant meditation on belief and memory. A small grant followed, then invitations to speak. Each time she presented the material, she showed a photograph of the valley, mist rising, sunlight cutting through the trees, and explained how history is never entirely silent. It murmurs through places, waiting for someone to listen. Audiences nodded, thoughtful. No one asked about the key. Years later, long after the article had become standard reading in courses on early American religion, Clara returned to the region on her way to another site. She stopped at a roadside overlook from which, on clear days, one could see the line of hills where the hollow lay hidden. The valley itself was invisible, but a thin thread of silver marked the path of the stream. She smiled. Whatever the covenant had been, it had done its work. It had kept the memory intact. As she turned to leave, a breeze came up from the west, carrying the faintest scent of pine and cold water. It was not an omen, not a call, just the natural breath of the hills. Still, she paused for a moment, listening, until the sound faded into the rustle of traffic. Then she drove on, content that some histories do not need resolving. They only need to be remembered. Years passed quietly. Clara's book, Water and Memory, Faith on the Frontier, found its way onto university reading lists and local historical society shelves. Students still wrote to her, drawn less by theology than by the human thread that ran through the Whitmore story. The way a single family had tried to speak to the land and leave proof of their listening. She answered their letters with patience, always encouraging them to visit the archives, to see the original handwriting, to decide for themselves what counted as truth. Her life became steady, almost ordinary. She taught, mentored, and kept up a ritual of visiting small museums across the state. Yet each spring, when the creeks thawed and the air smelled faintly of iron and pine, she felt the pull of the hills again. It was no longer an obsession, more like a familiar melody returning at the edge of hearing. Memory, she realized, had its own seasons. One afternoon, a young graduate student named Daniel stopped by her office. He had been researching regional folklore and had stumbled upon her early field notes. "Did you ever find out what happened to the Whitmore descendants?" he asked. Clara smiled. "I found that they kept moving west, following rivers. Every generation built near water, as if repeating a pattern they didn't quite understand." He looked fascinated. "Do you think the covenant was superstition?" She shook her head. "I think it was gratitude, the way we promise ourselves that what matters won't disappear." After he left, she opened her window. The city hummed below. Cars, voices, the faint rush of traffic like a faraway stream. She realized that the sound comforted her now. Once it had unsettled her, but the years had translated fear into understanding. The water still spoke. She had simply learned its language. That summer, the university received a donation from the Whitmore Foundation, a small endowment for field research. The accompanying note requested that Dr. Hensley supervise the first project. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a circle closing. She accepted gladly. guiding new students through the methods of preservation and the ethics of listening to the past. When she finally revisited the valley with her research team, it was in full bloom. The meeting house ruins had been stabilized by the Historical Society. Interpretive signs now stood nearby, telling visitors of early settlers, faith communities, and the enduring spring that never froze. Children played by the stream, their laughter echoing off the slopes. Clara watched them and felt a calm pride. History had found balance again, documented, respected, and alive. She filled one last notebook that day, recording the sound of the water, the temperature, the way sunlight moved through the trees. Then she wrote a closing line: "The covenant remains, not as burden, but as continuity. The valley remembers because we remember it." She tore the page neatly and placed it in a clear envelope for the local museum. When she handed it to the curator, she said, "Add this to the record. Every story deserves an echo." As she drove away, the road wound through green light and open fields. At a bend, she glimpsed the shimmer of the stream far below, like a ribbon of glass threading through time. She smiled, thinking of how every generation leaves something behind. A word, a key, a record, and how the land holds all of it patiently. In the rear-view mirror, the hills grew smaller, fading into horizon and memory alike. The covenant kept not by ritual but by simple remembrance. Even after returning to the city, Clara carried the calm of that last visit with her. The sound of the valley stayed somewhere in the back of her thoughts, not as a haunting, but as a reminder that listening itself could be an act of preservation. She began weaving that idea into her lectures. Archives, she would tell her students, are not dead places. They breathe through every reader who pauses long enough to hear what the paper is still saying. The students listened, sometimes puzzled, sometimes inspired. Many went on to find their own hollows, small, forgotten corners of history that waited patiently for rediscovery. As the years went on, the Whitmore story became less about one valley and more about the way memory moves through generations. Her research students uncovered small side trails, a hymn copied in the same hand as Elias's, a well in Ohio called the Covenant Spring, a pattern of families migrating westward along the same waterways. Each discovery felt like a tributary feeding a larger current of understanding. The record never ends, she wrote in her notes. It simply changes keepers. One autumn morning, she received a letter from Daniel, now teaching at another university. He enclosed a photograph of a newly built memorial near the hollow, a simple stone plaque that read, "Let the faithful endure." Beneath it, smaller letters added, "Dedicated to those who keep the record." The gesture moved her more than she expected. The phrase that had once echoed through her research now stood fixed in stone, a quiet gratitude from the present to the past. Later that week, she visited the local museum to check on the display where her final page had been added. The curator had placed it beside the recovered brass key, both labeled "Donated by Dr. Clara Hensley." Visitors paused there often, she noticed, reading the short inscription aloud, perhaps without understanding its weight. That was fine. Meaning belonged to whoever needed it. She left the museum smiling, content that the story no longer belonged solely to her. On her walk home, the first snow of the season began to fall, fine, bright flakes that melted as they touched the pavement. The city lights turned them into sparks. For a moment, she thought of the stream in winter, the way it had stayed unfrozen when everything else lay still. Maybe the covenant was nothing more than this, a way to remember that movement continues, that water still runs beneath ice, that silence itself can be a form of endurance. She reached her apartment, hung her coat, and placed her notebook on the desk. Before turning off the lamp, she opened it to a blank page and wrote one final sentence. Every story, once heard, becomes part of the one who hears it. She closed the cover, and the room settled into the comfortable quiet of evening. Outside, the snow kept falling softly, the flakes vanishing as they touched the window. still each one gone, yet part of the same endless pattern that had begun long before her and would continue long after. In that rhythm, she felt the same steady peace she had found beside the spring, the simple assurance that remembering was enough. Time, as always, began to fold quietly over the years. Students became colleagues. The once young professor whose boots had sunk into the mud of Whitmore Hollow now watched her own students return from the field with stories of their own discoveries. She rarely spoke of the valley anymore. Its name appeared only in bibliographies and footnotes, where scholars cited her for pioneering ethnographic sensitivity. Yet sometimes, when the first rains of March darkened the streets and the sound of water filled the gutters, Clara would look up from her desk and smile. The echo was still there, patient as ever. When she finally decided to retire, the university organized a small reception. Former students sent letters and photographs from archives around the country. One photograph, anonymous, showed a restored stone building with a plaque that read Meeting House 1794, Let the Faithful Endure. The caption underneath said only Greene County, Pa. Clara pinned it above her desk. It reminded her that history, when treated with care, keeps finding new hands to carry it forward. Her last act before leaving the campus was to visit the vault where the original Covenant journal still rested. The archivists had digitized every page and sealed the fragile volumes in climate-controlled glass. She stood for a long moment, reading the first line through the reflection. We have done as required. It no longer sounded ominous. It felt like a statement of endurance. Every historian, she thought, performs the same act doing as required, so the past may remain legible. That evening, she walked home through the spring dusk. The city smelled of rain on stone, of new leaves, of beginnings folded inside endings. At the river, she paused on the footbridge and watched the current slide beneath the lights. Somewhere far upstream, every tributary from the western hills joined this flow, the same water, perhaps, that rose from the Whitmore spring. The thought made her laugh softly. The Covenant had never been about boundaries at all. It was about connection. The record endures because the current never stops. In the quiet that followed, she took a small notebook from her bag, the same field journal she had carried on her first visit to the Hollow decades ago. The pages were nearly full now, written in two kinds of ink, early and late. On the final sheet she wrote, "The valley keeps its silence and I keep its story. Between us, that is enough." She tore out the page, folded it carefully, and let it fall into the river. The paper floated a moment, caught a glint of light, and then was gone, carried eastward toward larger waters. She watched until it vanished, then turned back toward the city, feeling the small, steady joy that comes when something has been finished properly. Behind her, the river continued its slow conversation with the night. And in the distant hills of western Pennsylvania, the spring still ran clear through every season, its sound no longer a summons but a song, gentle and constant, keeping time for those who once listened and for those who someday would again. Months after her retirement, Clara received a parcel with no return address. Inside was a slim monograph published by a regional museum. The Valley Remembered, A History of Whitmore Hollow. The dedication read, "For C.H., who taught us that listening is also preservation." She smiled, recognizing Daniel's careful phrasing. The work was modest. Maps, transcribed hymns, family trees. But its pages shimmered with the same respect that had first drawn her to the story. The record was alive again, multiplied through other voices. That evening, she walked to the park overlooking the river. The water below moved with the same slow certainty she had seen in the hills. Around her, people talked, bicycles rattled over the bridge, and somewhere a child laughed. A small, bright sound that blended perfectly with the murmur of the current. For a moment she imagined the voices of every researcher, every settler, every listener layered within that sound like strata in stone. Continuity, she thought, is not a chain but a chorus. She opened her notebook one last time, the final blank page waiting like a held breath, and wrote, "History is a conversation that never truly ends. It pauses, it changes speakers, but it keeps moving as water keeps moving toward light." Then she closed the cover and sat watching the evening settle over the river. The last light slid along the surface, turning the water to silver. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the creeks from the western hills were joining it, carrying with them all the echoes of the Covenant, all the fragments of memory that people had chosen to keep. Clara smiled, not at mystery, but at understanding, and whispered a single word into the wind: endure.